Alliance is the only community of any size in Western Europe where political consciousness and disbelief in capitalism were more normal than their opposites. Up here in Aragon, one was among tens of thousands of people, mainly but not entirely of working class origin, all living at the same level and mingling on terms of equality. In theory, it was perfect equality, and even in practice it was not very far from it. There is a sense in which it would be true to say that one was experiencing a foretaste of socialism, by which I mean the prevailing mental atmosphere was that of socialism. Many of the normal motives of civilised life, snobbishness, money grubbing, fear of the boss, etc., had simply ceased to exist. The ordinary class division of society had disappeared to an extent that is almost unthinkable in the money-tated era of England. There was no one except the peasants and ourselves, and no one owned anyone else as his master. Of course, such a state of affairs could not last. It was simply a temporary and local phase, an enormous game that's been played out over the whole surface of the earth, but it lasted long enough to have its effects upon anyone who experienced it. However much one cursed, at the time, one realised afterwards that one had been in contact with something strange and valuable. One had been in a community where hope was more normal than apathy or cynicism, where comrades stood for comradeship and not, as in most other countries, for humbug. One had breathed the air of equality. So I think, we'll see whether Jolly felt the same, but that was how obviously one important writer in the kind of first third of the 20th century felt when he experienced that period of Spanish history. So anyway, with that, I'll give my time to Mark to speak to Jolly.
Thank you, Kieran, and thank you everybody for coming along and listening to me on this lovely evening. Can you all hear me if I talk like this? Right down the back, you can. Let me see. When you write a book like this, it takes a while, at least in my case, because I'm working full time as well on other stuff. And so you really have to like your subject, to get right through to the end and not regret the whole project. And in this case, I did. And for a number of reasons, I think Doug Jolly was a very worthy subject, and I still liked him. And I still felt glad to put that much of my life into it after all that time. And I think there are several reasons why that is. One is that Doug Jolly never joined the Communist Party, despite what must have been enormous pressure to do so at different times. He served for something like 7 years in total on the front lines of 2 successive conflicts, especially World War II. Frequently within range of artillery fire and so on. To my knowledge, in all that time, he never used or even carried a weapon of any kind. That wasn't what he was there for. And so he wasn't a war lover, if you like, the way I think some people, who volunteer to go off to foreign conflicts are inclined to be. And furthermore, he was an international innovator, an international pioneer, a figure of really of world status in terms of what he achieved. Which is why, really, I published the book in 2 editions. This is the international edition, hardback, published by a university press in the States. The one you see up there is the local edition for sale in New Zealand and Australia. And both are doing pretty good on the whole. So what I plan to do tonight is just to run through briefly some of the main points. Kieran's touched on some of them about this guy. If you feel inclined to interject, to interrupt, to ask questions or clarifications, please do. You don't have to wait to the end. It would make sense to me to do that. If yours is a relatively complex potentially contentious question, might be best to save it to the end, otherwise you'll put me on my style. But if you're just saying, hang on, what did you mean about that or whatever, just let me know, I'll explain. So, let's see. As Kieran mentioned, I've been working on this project for a while. This book came out in 2009. It was the result of, it was based on a conference that we held in 2006. A very interesting and effective conference, the first one of its kind. No one had talked about New Zealand and the Spanish Civil War prior to that. Some people came from as far as Australia under their own steam to take part. And as you can see, Doug Jolly is one of those people who's described in the book, but at that point I didn't know much about him. However, that seemed to set me on a path that I cannot seem to get off, because there have been many more such projects since then, such as this book which was published a few years ago about a nurse named Dorothy Morris, wonderful woman, came from Wellington actually, and she ended up, she didn't do this straight away when she first went to Spain, but she ended up running children's hospitals for injured, often starving and frequently orphaned children in the Civil War. An important distinction between her and Jolly is that she always worked well behind the line. She worked in a southern town called Wellington, and it was in a safe zone, a Republican zone. It was well away from battle lines, at least for almost all of the war, and for that reason it was a good place to site hospitals like hers. Jolly was different. He worked on the front lines, hence the title of the book. A few years after that, we put a plaque up to Doug Jolly, on the wall of a building that his grandfather established back in the 19th century in the old part of Cromwell in central Otago. I don't know if anyone knows it, been there. This place is now under 60 metres of water in a hydro lake that's been created there. But what they did before they raised the lake, before they flooded that area, is they moved some of the historic buildings up onto high ground, which is now the shore of the lake. And Doug Jolly's grandfather's store was one of them. So that guy with me is a New Zealand doctor named David Lowe, wonderful guy. He's actually running the ICU, the intensive care unit at a big Sydney public hospital. And he has great interest in Doug Jolly, and as well as being very good at his job, he is, as it happens, an extraordinarily good historical researcher. And he tracked down Doug Jolly's large collection of personal papers all over the world. The last sort of address we had, the last place we knew anyone, any of his relatives to live, was in the Isle of Wight, on the shore of England. And so we started there. They'd gone. Next address was somewhere else. He kept tracing address after address, and eventually he tracked them down. Where were they? They were in Canberra, Australia. And as I say, he himself was living in Australia, in Sydney at the time. So he hopped in his car and he drove the 3 hours over to Canberra, and he met Doug Jolly's stepdaughter, the daughter of the woman Doug Jolly married. She has since died, but there she was, and she laid out this extraordinary collection of personal papers. I wish I could give you some idea of the extent and variety of it, but it includes, among other things, the complete manuscript of an unpublished novel, this one, and as well as a whole lot of letters and documents and so on that cover much of Jolly's life from early schooling to death. A whole lot of material in other media, if you like, such as the insignia on his uniforms, various uniforms. So this is, as I say, gold dust to a biographer, and I knew that I had to do something with this material. Anyway, so there's David looking at all this stuff and saying, geez, this is amazing. I know this guy in New Zealand who would write a book about it, and he could have access to this. And they said, take it. We're giving this stuff to you on permanent loan because we're not going to do anything with it. We've looked at these things. We don't understand most of them anyway. There's a lot of material in languages other than English there. They said, why don't you take this stuff back to Sydney with you, and it's up to you what you do with it after that. So he loaded the back of his car up with the stuff, and he drove back, and he let me know what was there. I flew to Sydney, photographed a lot with my phone, and we were rolling. We were underway. I found a publisher, two publishers actually, one for each edition of the book, and away I went. So, Doug Jolly came from Central Otago, as I said. And there he is with his family. He's the young kid on the left, and there is his mum and dad and the other members of his family. They look like a confident, close-knit family there, and indeed they were. I know they were close-knit because he continued to write to his mum from Spain, and you know, we've got those letters, all that sort of thing. And I know they were confident because the Jolly family ran, several generations of them ran the town's only general store, starting in the 1870s during the Gold Rush period. And there it is, back in the day, in the old part of town, which as I say is now underwater. And this store sold everything. Everything from ladies' fashions to kerosene. And it was the only one in town for a long time, and everybody went there. So it was on the main street in the town, and it was an important community facility, really. Jolly's grandfather, his father, and two of his brothers were all at various times mayors of Cullen, so a well-known and significant family. The boys, there were 6 boys, went to boarding school. They went to Otago Boys High on the train, boarded there during the term and came back on the holidays. Jolly was a sort of mediocre student in high school. C's and B's maybe. He was, however, an outstanding athlete. He was in the first 15 for 3 years. He was the fullback. That's him. Where are we? Second from the left in the middle row. Small guy, not big, but very fast, very strong, a lot of stamina, which served him well. Once he was standing beside an operating theatre, operating table in the middle of the Civil War, where the bodies just kept on coming. And in his final year, he was a prefect. There he is in the middle, in front, sitting down. He managed to get into Otago Medical School. At this stage, he was a Presbyterian. He was quite Christian. He thought he might become a medical missionary. The Presbyterians sent their doctors off overseas to China and other places. He thought that's what he might do. At university, as often happens, he became much more politically aware. We're talking about the 1920s, post-war period. A lot of World War I refugees and so on. He was very strongly influenced by the chaplain of the university, the guy who'd been a conscientious objector in World War I, and who became a kind of surrogate father to him. His own father was killed in World War I, killed in action. And he pretty soon gave up on the idea of being a medical missionary, and he also gave up on being a Christian, basically. He graduated in 1929, pretty near the top of his class, and outstanding, particularly in the field of surgery, which is what he decided to specialise in. He then went to England which is really what you had to do in those days to become a surgeon. You had to gain specialist qualifications. You needed to go abroad, and that's where he went, to England. And he worked for a number of years as a house surgeon, trainee surgeon, in a succession of big public hospitals like this one, newly built hospital called the Royal Masonic in Hammersmith in London. And there he gained very broad, general, useful knowledge, everything from obstetrics, through to broken legs and all kinds of stuff. I have no knowledge of medicine apart from putting on a Band-Aid, so I rely very heavily on advice from people like David Blood, from medical professionals like that, who kind of interpreted a lot of stuff for me, told me what to make of these kind of situations. And Jolly was a few months short of becoming a fully fledged surgeon when he decided to not do that and instead to go to Spain as a volunteer, as a medical volunteer, and contribute his skills to the Republican Army's medical corps in the Civil War. This was, if you think about it, an extraordinary thing to do, because he'd spent maybe 10 years of his life training to get that qualification, and he broke it off. It's likely, as you do, that he thought that it might be a relatively small-scale, localised scrap that would be over in a few months and he could go back and finish off his training. That didn't happen. And this decision was to really alter the whole course of his life. But nonetheless, he did it. Now, he obviously wasn't the only one, the only New Zealander to go to Spain. There were volunteers, both combatant and non-combatant, quite a few from different parts of the country, such as this guy, the one with the gun, Bert Bryan from here, from Wellington, the guy from Wellington. I actually met people who had known him when I was doing that book, my first book, Kiwi Compañeros. They were elderly when I met them, and they were children when they met him. But they were, there was a living link between them. The guy in front of him was an Australian, Jack Franklin, member of the IWW, the Wobblies, quite a few of those, volunteered for Spain. Jolly, however, as I say, was a non-combatant, and he registered with the Republican Army's medical services, and can we see his passport? It's we got it. Karen has pointed out to me that this document is written in a mixture of Spanish and French. That's what things were like over there. It was a bit chaotic. There was a hell of a lot of different languages spoken. Mao's Red Army sent 100 Chinese to the Civil War. Can you imagine how lonely those guys were? They didn't speak any language that anyone there spoke, probably. But they served valiantly throughout the Civil War. This passport gives Jolly's nationality as English. He wasn't. His profession as surgeon, he wasn't, because he wasn't properly qualified. And his political affiliation as an anti-fascist, which he certainly was. And that remained his political affiliation throughout his life. I have no record of him ever joining a political party or any other organised political body. But he was always a confirmed anti-fascist. He was immediately placed in charge of a mobile surgical unit, a little group of people, I think about 11 to start with, nurses, doctors, ambulance drivers, an electrician, a carpenter, because they basically had to, build their own gear as they went along. Initially they were based around Madrid, which was under attack from 3 different directions. The Franco forces were attempting to capture Madrid and three different generals commanded three different nationalist battalions, including and of course, as they said, they had a fourth inside the city already. This is the origin of the term, four directions and a fifth one inside. This is the origin of the term fifth column, meaning sort of covert, what do they call it, traitors within an organisation. Franco said, I've got four generals attacking, I've got four columns attacking Madrid and a fifth one inside it already. And he was right. There were covert fascist sympathisers in Madrid, hidden among Republican forces. The quartermaster of the International Brigade was a covert fascist, and he made sure that whenever a piece of machinery was checked out, it went with emery dust mixed with the lubricating oil. It fucked the variants within days. So there were people like that there. They were signalling to the bombers to let them know they could drop their bombs at night. Jolly was posted, as I say, around Madrid. He had this 11-person unit. They spoke about 6 or 7 different languages. A lot of them had no common language. They just communicated with gestures for a while until they could sort of scrape along and pidgin Spanish. It was a very, very tough time. The equipment was inadequate, their training was often nearly non-existent. Excellent. We'll jump ahead. Can we go back on? This is Jolly's anaesthetist, Peter de Sarani. Before he went to Spain, he was a chef at Hotel Savoy in London. That's how much training he had in any kind of medical activity. But Jolly needed an anaesthetist badly. He said to this guy, don't be a combatant, don't go out and get killed on the front lines. I'll train you in anaesthetics. It might take me a couple of days. And then you can put the first patient under. He did, it worked. They wouldn't do that now. And nor should they. But in those days, they had no choice. So that guy served with Jolly for several years and remained a loyal friend of his thereafter. And the conditions were tough, as I say. They had freezing cold conditions. Here they are stuck in snow in the Battle of Teruel, late 1937. And they had blistering heat. Here they are in the Battle of the Ebro, the following summer. The guy on the left is a US surgeon called Frontline Surgeon, who was assisting Jolly, and the woman in between them is Jolly's dedicated, highly experienced, somewhat older theatre nurse, Hungarian woman named Anna Maria Bash, extraordinary woman. And both her husband and their son had also come to Spain as volunteers and were both serving on the front lines. His son was, I think, 16, he put his age up to 20, and they agreed to take him, and he served throughout the Civil War, eventually with the rank of sergeant. So, she was a married woman with a child. She and Jolly became lovers. This was not uncommon in the Civil War. You never knew whether you would see your partner again, or if you did, whether he would turn up on your operating theatre with his head blown half off. And so you got your little moments of joy while you could. And who could blame them for that? They were very close. He speaks very, very warmly of her, and she of him in the letters that I read. This is a weird photo, and I debated whether or not to include it. That's done in his undies. And the other guy is that fellow Peter de Sarani that I told you about, his anaesthetist. And they are clearly, I don't know much about this photograph, except that they are evidently rehearsing a production of William Tell. This guy has an apple on his head, Peter de Sarani's going to shoot it off. They have a homemade photo. The reason I included this is that they had moments of lightheartedness, and as well, Jolly, as well as being extraordinarily efficient, competent, and dedicated surgeon, was also a performer. He had a beautiful singing voice. He was in demand to sing at all sorts of public events throughout his life. And he liked to have fun, to play games, you know, to entertain people, and that's what he's doing now. So this is the sort of hospital that they would create. That's his field hospital, seen from above. It's in tents there. They also used improvised buildings, shepherd's huts, God knows what. The most important thing was that they should not be identifiable from the air. The nationalist aircraft, which were both German and Italian, so both Mussolini's and Hitler's top-of-the-line military equipment was sent to Spain. They used the Civil War as a dry run for World War II, so they tested out their most current, advanced, and effective equipment over there, and also their it was the first time they had an opportunity to practice intensive bombing of an urban built-up area. This had never happened in warfare before. Hence the Battle of Guernica, which you would have heard of in the Basque Country. Jolly wasn't there. This was not a front that he served on, but it's an example of the kind of experimental military strategies that were employed in that war, particularly by the nationalists. Guernica was an undefended town of no military significance, but it was a very historic and sacred town of the Basques. They completely destroyed it. And Pablo Picasso painted that picture about it, which you know. So this is a field hospital in the Ebro Valley, in the Catalan area of Spain, in the north-east, that Jolly ran with his team, as I say, about 11 or 12 people. And it would be near the front lines, maybe 1 or 2 kilometres, at most 3 or 4, walking distance, hobbling distance from the front line. So the walking wounded would get there on their own, the rest would be carried in stretchers, or if they were lucky, if there was a road, in ambulances. There often wasn't a road. It was always necessary to disguise these hospitals, and in this case, this is a blood transfusion truck, and they are hastily disguising it with olive branches to protect it from approaching enemy aviation. It was also necessary, one of the first things that Jolly insisted that his staff do as soon as they set up a new hospital anywhere was to dig a foxhole. And everybody, didn't matter if you're a surgeon or a carpenter or a nurse or whatever, you've got a spade and you dug a foxhole. And very frequently they had to break off operating to die to do it. So it was, as I say, an extraordinarily tough and an unsatisfactory way in which to practice surgery, but they did it, and they did it to an extraordinarily high standard. Their results were amazing. I've seen the figures. Their recovery rate, Jolly tried very hard not to amputate limbs, which was the sort of standard way of dealing with the limb injuries in wartime up until that point. He knew how hard it would be for these guys to go back home with a missing foot, or missing leg, or missing hand. And so he did all he could to avoid that, and he succeeded remarkably. He was known for being able to perform complex surgery, abdominal surgery. These guys have been gut shot. They've had a burst of machine gun fire in the belly. And to operate in this way required very careful, minute inspection of the intestines to ensure there were no holes in them, basically, and to patch them up with the graft. And Jolly was famed for his success at this operation, and also for his stamina. He would operate at high speed, non-stop, all day, all night, all the next day. This is on record. teams of nurses and assistants and anaesthetists dropping with exhaustion and being replaced by others, and he would keep going because there was no one to replace him. So, you know, an impressive guy. He served right through to the end of 1938, when all international volunteers to the Civil War were compelled to withdraw. This was a last-ditch, desperate strategy by the Republican Army, who were losing the war badly at that point. They hoped that by doing so they would compel their opponents to do the same. They would strike a deal and say, okay, we'll pull out all the foreigners, because this would mean that Hitler and Mussolini would have to withdraw their troops, who were, I should point out, all professional soldiers. They were trained military personnel. There were very few of those on the Republican side. So the international brigades were withdrawn. Of course, the Germans and Italians all stayed. So Jolly went back to London, and what did he do then, after that experience that he'd had? He probably went on a speaking tour right throughout Britain, in mining towns, talking to in union halls, probably in pubs like this one, talking to any group that would listen to him, urging them to continue to support Spain because the war was still going, and he maintained that it could still be won at that point. It didn't look very likely, but he wanted to be doing the job. So he spoke from one end of Britain to the other, and then he went back home to his family, to New Zealand. And then he did the same all over again. He spoke from Invercargill to Kaitaia. Little places, big places. This is one of the biggest. This is the poster for a public meeting in Auckland. The poet R.A.K. Mason wrote a soliloquy which was for Spain, for the dead in Spain, which was part of the event that he's, that he's speaking at. And he was a very effective speaker because he was a decorated military officer. It was a bit hard to argue that he was some sort of nifty, woolly, hooked, bloody sellout, unpatriotic guy. And even people who disagreed with his politics were compelled to admire his military record. So then, on the way back to Britain, as soon as he'd seen his family, had that speaking tour, he made his way back to Britain on a tramp steamer. There were no liners, there were no regular shipping passenger ships travelling to Britain at that time because of submarines and so on. But he managed to get a trip on a tramp steamer. He worked as passage as a coding officer, so he spent long hours decoding messages for the captain. And on the way, he thought, I'm going to write down my experience of what happened in Spain in a book, because by then it was obvious it was going to be a world war. He and others went to Spain largely, they said, to avoid a world war, to try and contain Hitler and Mussolini from expanding their empire any further than that. They failed, they lost in Spain. It was clear there was going to be a world war in Europe, and he was going to be in it. So he knew that Spain, the people of Spain and volunteers there like him, had more useful experience of the forthcoming world war than anybody else in the world. They knew what it was like to be in a city that was being intensively bombed, firebombed. So no one else did. There was nowhere else was going to happen anyway. In London, they thought they were preparing themselves for bombing by, telling people to make a corrugated iron shelter in their back garden. Seriously. If you hear planes coming, go into your Anderson shelter. They had to see an Anderson shelter. It was a piece of shit. But he knew about medical services to treat the kind of unforeseen, unknown injuries. We're talking about blast injuries. We're talking about the kind of injuries that happen when you're in an apartment building which is collapsing around you. No no doctors had experience of treating injuries like that because it was an extraordinarily uncommon thing to do. But he had that experience, and so he wrote a manual. That one, Field Surgery and Social War. Unsurprisingly, it was a worldwide bestseller. There was a US edition. It was translated into other languages, and all these young doctors went off to war with this book. They wrote about it. I've seen their letters, their reviews. It was reviewed in the Lancet, it was reviewed in the British Medical Journal, it was reviewed in the US equivalent of the British Medical Journal. So this New Zealand guy was the world expert really in frontline surgery in what he called total war. By total war, he meant a war that involves an entire population, civilians as well as the professional military, and a war in which you could expect that civilian casualties would outnumber military ones. And his book was widely used. It was directly responsible for the creation of a mobile field surgery unit by the New Zealand military in Egypt, in Mali, Egypt in 1941. Jolly played no part in this. He had signed up, sorry, I've got to jump ahead. He signed up with the Royal Army Medical Corps, so here we are with the Brits. He had been in Britain before the Spanish Civil War. He had friends there. He obviously decided to work with this large institution, with a large army, with a lot of resources, rather than with the New Zealand Army. So there he was signed up with the Poles to work for them. However, the New Zealand Army read his book, and they said, that's what we need, and they set up a mobile field surgery unit in the desert. There they were, working away in a tent when the war in the desert, this is Rommel, you would have heard about it. It was very fast moving, it was very motorised. You could drive at high speed across the desert in the kind of vehicles that they had. So these German guys show up in trucks, and they go and they walk into the tent, and they say, in perfect English apparently, they pull out their movers and they say, right, our injured are going to go to the front of the queue, and you're just going to stay here and you're just going to keep working. You're doing fine, we just need you to treat our blokes instead of your blokes. And that's what happened for several weeks actually, when the New Zealanders managed to escape. They managed to hijack some vehicles in the night and shoot through and rejoin their own lines. The front line was that mobile. The head surgeon said he had to leave behind his precious copy of what? Of Doug Jolly's book, which was his one and only manual for telling him what to do. But he left it behind, but he later went back and got it. I've seen that book, it's covered in it, it's very stained. It's not in good shape, but it is readable. So Jolly, as I say, did not work in this unit with the New Zealanders. He worked with the Royal Army Medical Corps, and for much of the time he worked in Tobruk in Libya. And as in Spain, they commandeered buildings and turned them into hospitals. This building had been a school before the war, and it still had pro-Mussolini slogans painted on the walls. Nobody got around to removing them. This is number 62 General Hospital in Tobruk. It was, as you may have heard, the siege of Tobruk, and Jolly served throughout the siege. The siege was eventually broken. New Zealand troops were extremely instrumental in breaking it. So Jolly served there. They eventually drove Rommel and his troops out of North Africa, and then they regrouped first in Sicily and then in the Italian mainland, and they kept chasing them up through Europe. So Jolly's next hospital is this one, which is in a town called Caserta, which is just north of Naples. And he worked there for the rest of the war, right through to maybe Mob. This was a hospital that was a sort of combined New Zealand and British hospital, so he actually got to treat New Zealanders and meet up with other Kiwi guys, even though it was mostly on his operating table that he met them. He served as the chief surgeon in both of those hospitals. By this time he had the rank of lieutenant colonel, and he had been awarded a military OBE. The OBE was a civil decoration for bravery in wartime, so it was introduced in World War I for ambulance drivers and firefighters and nurses and so on. But they eventually realised that there needed to be a military version because there were non-combatants serving in the military who were very courageous. And Jolly was one of them, and he got the military OBE. It's a rare decoration, not many qualified, but he held it by the time he was demobbed. Okay, this is where the story gets kind of weird. So, by the time he finishes, by the time he goes back to London, he's a civilian. And a lot of guys who'd served in wartime found it hard to adjust to civilian life. Jolly probably did, although I'm sure he was also very glad to see the back end of the war and to be back home again. He is authoritatively described as having more experience in abdominal operations than any other surgeon in history. Not just in Britain, not just in New Zealand, but anywhere at any time. So an unusual guy, right? He never worked as a surgeon again. Is that because he didn't want to? No. It's because if you remember, just before the Spanish Civil War, he had almost not quite qualified for a membership of the Royal College of Surgeons. They never admitted him as a surgeon. At one point, he looked to sit the exam. It's a famously rigorous exam, but he didn't, and the college did not give him membership. He had more experience than his own examiners, but he never became a qualified surgeon, which meant he was never allowed to practice surgery. So he worked a lot of the time in this hospital here. It's called Queen Mary's Hospital, set up in World War I to treat orthopaedic patients, people who lost their limbs in World War I. And you can see the workshop where they make the limbs. There they are, making false legs, false arms and so on. Jolly worked there for the rest of his career, but not as a surgeon. His work was non-clinical, as they say. He eventually ended up as the chief medical officer of this hospital, which is quite an important senior position, but it's not one that involved him actually hands-on doing medicine. It was an administrative post, basically. He did get on well with the patients. One of them whom I have heard of, I don't know if you guys have, was a guy called Douglas Barder. And he was people my age have heard of Douglas Barder because he was a Spitfire pilot who had lost both his legs. And he flew Spitfires very well, apparently, with two artificial legs. At one point he was shot down, parachuted out, ended up in a German prison camp. One of his legs was buggered on landing, and the Germans allowed him to receive another one through Red Cross. And after the war, he still had no legs, obviously, and he still needed his artificial ones and his stumps patched up, and Jolly did that. It's a weird situation that he wasn't such an extraordinarily gifted and dedicated surgeon, was not permitted to practice his profession after the war, and this went right through to his retirement in his 60s. Oh, back, please. Back, please. There he is in his passport photo. That's what he looked like in later life, a nice old guy. And it's a shameful and disgraceful thing that the Royal College of Surgeons did not admit him. This is not my opinion. This is the opinion of people like Sir Archibald Cochrane, who is a man who was knighted for his services to surgery. And he said quite clearly, Doug Jolly was a better surgeon than I was, and he had more experience than I was. Archie Cochran got knighted. Doug Jolly got nothing. Some of these guys ended up getting hospitals named after them, medical procedures named after them. They became giants of the National Health Service after World War II. And Jolly lived very quietly in a little cottage with his wife. He got married after the war, in a little cottage in a little village outside London, and worked quietly away in that lymphatic hospital for the rest of his career. It's a weird, mysterious thing. While I was writing this book, I was contacted by 2 British surgeons, and they said, "We understand you're writing a book about Doug Jolly, we just thought we'd let you know that we greatly admire him. Everything we read about him tells us that he was an extraordinary figure who was grotesquely and grossly and mysteriously underrated and in fact forgotten." And so they said, "We're going to go to our professional institute, the Royal College of Surgeons, and we're going to ask them to retrospectively and posthumously make him a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons, because he's entitled to belong. And this will be one way, at least, of sort of belatedly recognising his contribution to our field." The Royal College of Surgeons said, "No, we don't do that, we're not going to do it. We've never done it before, we're not going to do it now. Forget it." So he never was and he never will be regarded as a surgeon. So that's pretty much the end of the book, but it's not the end of the story, because these things have a way of keeping on. What is that? That is an archaeological excavation of a graveyard, of an informal cemetery. Doug Jolly saved a lot of people's lives, but he couldn't save all of them. And every morning there would be a mournful parade of carrying out those who didn't make it during the night. And they were buried next door to the hospital. We're in the hospital. We saw that photograph of the hospital in a tent and a field. Well, this is the graveyard next to it, or next to one of them anyway. Again, in the Catalan area. Spain has had a great deal of difficulty to come to terms with the Spanish Civil War. It divided the country, obviously, half fought for one side, half fought for the other. The country is still bitterly divided. Certain parts of the country are coming to terms with it better than others. You could think, if you like, of a comparison with the New Zealand wars. A civil war of a sort in this country with a racial component, which we have not yet come to terms with. And the Catalan area, because it was staunchly Republican, has come to terms with it better than most, and they have funded a team of archaeologists to go around and dig up battle sites, graveyards like this, mass graves where people were lined up and shot along there. This wasn't a mass grave. As you can see, these are all individual plots. These guys were buried as reverently and carefully as possible. They might even have had gravestones. They might even have had their names on their gravestones. I don't know. In some cases, the doctors didn't know their names. They tried to bury them in a blanket if they could, but at times they couldn't because they were so short of blankets that there'd be a tug of war between the nurses and the guy's surviving friends who wanted to keep this blanket. And the nurse would say, "It's no good to him now, but I've got other patients in there who might not survive unless they've got a blanket, so you're going to give that back." And so they were buried, as you see, in large numbers. Now, the reason that places like this are being excavated is that their descendants want to know where their forebears ended up and what they did in the Civil War often, and they just want to get some closure, you know? They want to. The most famous example is the poet Garcia Lorca. You may have heard of him, staunch Republican, shot and killed by the nationalists in the early days of the war because he was gay. And he is buried in a mass grave. It can't be excavated because the descendants of some of the other people in that mass grave don't want it excavated. They say, "No, it's in the past, forget it. We don't want to be reminded, it's not going to happen." They don't know which bit of the grave he's in and which bit of the grave the others are in, so none of it gets excavated. That's how it goes. But these people want their forebears excavated, and they want to identify them if possible. One of the ways to identify them is to look at the surgical records to see whether the surgeon knew or was able in some way to identify who those guys are. So the archaeologist got in touch with me, of all people, here in New Zealand, and said, can you help us? And I gave them what information I could. I don't know how useful it is, but this is an ongoing project. It will be going on for years yet, and I expect to be contacted by them again when they uncover another grave where Jolly was the head surgeon. And I'm very happy to do that. It's not something I ever counted on doing, it's not something I ever had any experience of doing. But if it's going to help the relatives, the descendants of those who served on the Republican side of the Civil War, then I'll do what I can. Another thing, and another example of how divided Spain is that the country still to this day has no museum of the Spanish Civil War. A remarkable thing when you think about it. But it doesn't, and the reason it doesn't is because of that huge division. The right-wingers of the country say, well, if you're going to fund that museum out of taxpayers' money, out of our money, then it's going to say all these nice things about Franco. And the Republicans are saying, well, if you insist on saying that about Franco, we are out. And so never the twain shall meet. Right? So there is no national memorial of any kind to the Spanish Civil War, except those that were created during the very long Franco dictatorship, which are basically memorials to Franco, the nationalists, obviously. So, in the absence of a national museum of the Spanish Civil War, there is a virtual museum of the Spanish Civil War, as we said, and it's a website. It's actually hosted in Canada by a university history department in Canada. And it's very like Tiara. Does anyone know what Tiara is? Hold your hands up. Okay, Tiara is a national, what is it, a national encyclopedia as a website. It's the first ever in the world national encyclopedia that's born digital. It's intended to be digital. So I didn't know about it until they contacted me and said, we've got this website, and would you write an entry on New Zealand in the Spanish Civil War? I was very glad to do that. Even that's not the end of the story. I was actually in touch with the general editor of this website just this morning, as a matter of fact, because he wanted to have an entry. When he read my book, he wanted to have an entry on. He wanted to have a page, a thing, about Anna Maria Bash, that nurse I mentioned, the one with the glasses, the Hungarian nurse. They've got an entry on Hungarians in the Spanish War, a lot of Hungarians in the Spanish War, but she was an exceptionally impressive nurse, and he wanted to have a special entry on her. So I was able to put in touch with a woman, a professional translator, who knows about Anna Maria Bash, and she has written that entry, and we were sort of discussing the finishing touches to it. One cool thing about this website is that you can have different languages. So all the stuff about the Basque country in the Spanish Civil War, about Guernica and so on, is in several languages, French and Spanish obviously, but also the Basque. And the Basque government paid for the translation, for the whole thing to be translated to Basque. The Hungarian entry obviously is in French, Spanish, and Hungarian, and English. And the same with the German entries in German, and the Chinese entries in Chinese, and so on and so on. The New Zealand entries not in Maori. I didn't feel that I was up to it, and I haven't found anybody yet who's prepared to translate it. But that's, as I say, an ongoing project because it's virtual, because it's digital. You don't have to lock it down. New information is coming to light all the time. That photograph I showed you of Bert Ryan firing his gun, that photograph turned up in an old lady's house in Australia just last year. It made it into the Guardian newspaper in Britain because it was such an extraordinary photograph and such a remarkable thing to happen. So that photograph is now gone up on the website. Things like that are going to continue to happen. And that's all I had, except that I do I do say very sincerely, and I hope you're going to help me out here, that you, in the remaining time that we have, which might not be much, but if anyone wants to stick around, have a drink with me and ask me any questions, talk about what you're doing or whatever, I'd be happy to do that. That's all I have to say. Thank you for listening. One more very important thing, my dear friends, and your head markers, I bought along copies of my book. They run Bookhaven in Newtown, the city's best bookshop. And there are my books by the door. We'd be grateful if you would, at the very least, take a look at them and perhaps even go further with that. Phew, that was a lot to say. I'm not great in real time. I've never done any lecturing or teaching or anything like that because I'm so crap at it. And so this is a challenge for me doing something like this. I prefer to be able to edit myself repeatedly, and I don't get the chance when I talk.
Oh, you did a very fine job, Mark. So, why don't we take about a 5-minute break? We can go to the bathroom, get another drink, and then maybe we can come back for 2 or 3 questions here, and then if people want to stick around and chat further, they can do that. Yeah. Well, thanks again, Mark. It was a really fascinating talk, and I'm going to use my prerogative up here to ask the first question. Could you, Angus, could you go back to that slide? Sorry, mate, with the front cover of this booklet on field surgery. I'm kind of curious, Mark, and I know this is a bit cliche in New Zealand history around, New Zealanders supposed pragmatic instinct and, natural inventiveness, etc. But some of the language he's using there at the bottom in particular is quite or rather, this is the review, I suppose, in the Lancet. They're picking up on some of these things. He writes, with shrewd judgment and a sane, practical outlook, and a lucid and occasionally epigrammatic style, he was obviously very clearly, simply, he had practical, rules to follow in field medicine. I wonder whether he himself ever, was he taking to some extent some of his inspiration from growing up in New Zealand and Otago specifically in the way that he practiced medicine. I'm thinking we were talking earlier about, Hemingway's Beltolls, which picks up on how desperate the conditions were for Republicans. They didn't have the resources that the other side had. They had to work with what they had, and there's a kind of Kiwi element there too of working with what you've got rather than what you'd like to have. So I wonder whether that helped him or whether he reflected on his upbringing, serving him.
It's a good question, and like most good questions, I don't really know the answer. All I can say is that he grew up in a Presbyterian family that rated education very highly. Neither of his parents had any tertiary education, but he and all his siblings did, which was unusual at that time, especially as they had no father. From the age of 14, when his dad died in World War I, his mother had to bring him up on her own, and that wasn't easy for him. Nonetheless, she ensured that all 7 of her children eventually graduated from university. Doug in particular, I think, enjoyed writing. There is, I think I showed you at one point in his personal papers, a page or 2 from that unpublished novel of his. That's a historical novel that's set in the gold rush times in Central Otago. I think it's probably based on experiences that his grandfather probably had. His grandfather was a Scotsman, born in Scotland, worked as a seaman, came out to New Zealand on an immigrant ship in the 1860s, got to Otago with a bunch of Scottish immigrants, heard that gold had been discovered inland and jumped ship. Immediately abandoned his career as a seaman and walked inland to Otago, took him back to Cromwell, where the gold was being found. He never found any himself, but he did set up a store, and that became a family dynasty. So the family was, in Doug's time, they weren't wealthy, but they were financially secure, and they had a lot of confidence in themselves. And Jolly, I think he enjoyed writing. After the Second World War, there he is in London, he's not allowed to practice surgery. There are letters in his personal collection, about 4 or 5 different letters in which he tries to get work as a writer, basically. He offers proposals for books to various publishing houses, they all get to him. So I think he's a very good writer. That book that he did get published, Field Surgery and Total War, it's a good read. That business about an epigrammatic style. It's full of wry humour, the book. He says, very often the patients will come in from the battlefront, badly injured and so on, their uniforms in such a bad state that the only thing to be done with them is to burn them. If you're going to do that, always check all the pockets. It's very unpleasant to have a hand grenade go off in the incinerator. The guy burning it is not going to like it. Check every pocket, that kind of thing. It's full of little asides like that, He says that the best guy to have as your surgical assistant is someone who's been a barber in civilian life. You need to shave people before an operation of them, or guys anyway, particularly, Get rid of the body hair before you go in with a knife. A barber does this at great speed and without nicking people. So if you've got any barbers in your unit, you tell them, okay, put down your gun, you're going to go back to being a barber now, you're going to work with the doctors. This kind of thing. Another manuscript that turned up, it wasn't in his personal papers, but one of his sort of relatives got in touch with me from the British town of Brighton and said, I've got a box of stuff in my attic about Jolly, would you like it? And I said, I certainly would. She sent it over. And it included the complete manuscript of a book called Surgical Curiosities in 2 Wars. And this is a book he wrote, he obviously intended to publish it, and it did. And his little story is about the weirdest things that he encountered in his time. Do you want to hear one? I'll try and be quick, okay? He says, surgeons, when they get together, they often find themselves talking about which of all the people they treated had the smallest chance of survival. He said, in my case, it was Major Miguel Moreno. Major Moreno headed a small special ops unit of the Republican Army. They worked behind enemy lines, basically carrying out sabotage operations, blowing bridges, derailling trains, that kind of thing. One dark, moonless night, they were making their way towards a bridge that was a crucial communications link in advance of a big Francoist attack. And he and about half a dozen of his troops were leading 2 donkeys loaded with the dynamite and other sort of explosive material in wicker baskets. A guard on the bridge heard a noise in the darkness and fired at the noise. Couldn't see anything, maybe heard a stone slip or something, fired at the noise. Happened to hit one of the baskets. Complete fluid. It ignited the dynamite. That was the end of the donkey, right? And the major who was leading the donkey was very badly injured. He was concussed, he broke a number of bones, he had internal injuries, but worst of all, he had material embedded in his body. Bits of dead donkey, bits of wicker from the basket, dirt, stones, God knows what. Anyway, he was in bad shape, but his men got him away from the bridge before they were captured into the darkness. Because they were behind enemy lines, they could only move at night. It was 4 days before they got the major behind Republican lines and into a field hospital, which happened to be Jolly's hospital. Jolly said when he reached my operating table, he was recognisable as a human being only in general outcome. Now I can't imagine, and I don't want to imagine what a guy like that looks like, but I know that, you know, it wasn't pretty, right? And this is before the days of penicillin, a few years before penicillin was introduced. Jolly was one of the first doctors in the world to make use of penicillin in surgery, but he didn't have access to it then, only much less effective kind of antibiotics. Nonetheless, he saved the guy. And as soon as he was stable enough to be moved, he was moved. And that's the way his field hospitals work. They were very small. They were like an A&E department in a public hospital. They didn't have the capacity for their patients to recover completely. As soon as you were no longer critical, they shunted you off to somewhere else where you could recover. And that's what happened to Major Moreno. And of course, Jolly couldn't keep in touch. He didn't know, what happens to his patients after they move on. They didn't have phones. However, by a fluke, a year later, he ran into him on another front, in another part of Spain. And he saw this guy in Spanish Republican Army uniform. He said he was a tall, well-built, handsome army officer. And apart from some rather unusual facial scars, you wouldn't know that he had this real brush with death. And what particularly surprises me is that Major Moreno was still heading up this Black Ops unit while the enemy lines. This incredibly dangerous work that had so very nearly gotten him killed a year earlier. He got straight back into that job, that role in the war. His story doesn't appear in any account of the Spanish Civil War, either in Spanish, in English, or any other language. I am informed. I'm informed, reliably informed by historians of the Spanish Civil War. Only in Jolly's manuscript. And so I'm glad to refer that. I've digressed a bit. I'm sorry.
It's a very interesting digression. I'm proud to myself. Okay, I think let's see if there are any questions.
Yeah, Mr. Buchanan.
Firstly, I think I have never been to a talk that has made me feel more warmly about a historical figure. So congratulations, you did that very well. I also just want to say, if you haven't read Homage to Catalonia, don't go about and buy a copy because the Freedom Shop's going to reprint it next year. And the actual question I have...
Homage to Catalonia when I was 16. It made a big impression on me. I've since read Wellington, which possibly made me even stronger than that.
We'll talk about that later, but yeah. I do have a question. I know a lot of veterans of the Spanish Civil War who went to, offered their services to the British Army or whoever, were basically turned down on political grounds. And Yank Levy comes to mind that they were basically seen as too suspect to be incorporated in the British Army, but that doesn't seem to be the case with the medical people. If this is an example is to be taken as normal, but was there any, is there any evidence that he was sort of seen as politically suspect because of his activities in Spain?
It's a very good question again, and I looked for that evidence. I have to say I didn't find it. I didn't find archival evidence that said this guy's a lefty, watch him. But we're talking about Britain in the 50s, very conservative time. I certainly think that his political record would have counted against him, but I don't think that it was the only or even necessarily the major factor. And the reason I think that is that other surgeons that worked with him, who were his colleagues, who knew him, who were his friends, were on the left in the same way that he was, in some cases more so. In some cases they were paid up party members, which he never was. And they got jobs in the British medical establishment when they went back to Britain. People like Archie Cochrane, people like Reginald Saxton, people like somebody rather Tudor Hart, he was a CBG member. They became hugely important figures in the British medical establishment after the Civil War. And their political affiliations were known. Archie Saxton spent his career working in mining communities, dealing with black lung and mining diseases like that. So that can't be the only reason. I think he was a colonial, and that you know, that would have been problems. Very, very snobby sort of field, surgery, college of surgeons. There was one other reason, but I'm not going to tell you because it's a bit of a spoiler for reading the book.
Mark and I were talking just before the bar about Keith Park, who was the very senior RAF officer in charge of a critical part of the defence of Britain during the Battle of Britain, New Zealander, and he too fell afoul of the kind of political manoeuvrings in the RAF as the war was coming to a close, and his career was kind of, to some extent, subdued. And I wonder if it's kind of the same, you know, that's what you're saying with being a colonial, and you know, he had done, you know, the chief of staff of the RAF said, you know, the war could be lost in an hour if it weren't for the judgment of this one individual, Keith Park, but then after the war he kind of got shut off.
It's a weird thing that the name Douglas Jolly does not appear in the official war histories of Britain or New Zealand. It does appear, however, in the official histories of the US Army's Second World War, because they say how important his book was to them and the surgeons. So they acknowledge his contribution. But neither the Poms nor the Kiwis have remembered him officially in any way. It's a mysterious and gaping gap in the historical record.